April 1945. Sandbostel, northern Germany. The spring air carried the smell of turned earth and distant smoke, mingling with something sharper, the scent of unwashed bodies and fear that clung to the barbed wire like morning dew. Hildegard Schneider sat with her back against the wooden barrack wall, her spine pressing into splinters she no longer felt. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to piano keys and embroidered linens, now resembled the gnarled roots of winter trees. She was 28 years old. She felt 60. Around her, 240 women waited in a silence that hummed with tension, their eyes tracking the British soldiers who moved through the compound with expressions that revealed nothing. The women had heard stories, whispered accounts of what victorious armies did to the defeated. They had seen the newsreels in reverse, understood that history was a wheel, and now they sat on the underside of its turning. When the first British truck rolled through the gates that morning, Hildegard had felt her stomach contract. Not from hunger, though hunger had been her constant companion for 8 months. This was different. This was the primal knowledge that the world as she understood it had ended, and what came next existed in a realm of terrible unknowns. The British soldiers, boys really, most of them not yet 25, began unloading wooden crates from the trucks. The women watched, waited. Several soldiers approached with the crates, and Hildegard noticed that their movements were deliberate, almost careful. One soldier, sandy-haired with a sunburned nose, knelt down beside an elderly woman who sat hunched against a fence post. He opened a tin and withdrew a piece of bread, real bread, pale and soft, not the sawdust mixture they had choked down in the final weeks. He held it toward her, extending it slowly, the way one might offer food to a frightened animal. The elderly woman flinched, pulling back. Her eyes went wide. The soldier spoke in English, words that meant nothing to her, but his voice was quiet. He broke the bread in half, placed one piece in his own mouth, chewed, swallowed. Then he offered the other half again. The woman stared. Her hand trembled as it rose, fingers like white twigs, and took the bread. She brought it to her nose first, inhaling as if the smell alone might be poison or illusion. Then she bit, and tears began streaming down her weathered cheeks. This scene repeated itself across the compound, British soldiers kneeling, offering food by hand, speaking in low voices, waiting for acceptance. Hildegard watched as a young corporal approached her. He could not have been more than 22. His uniform still held its shape, unlike the threadbare fabric that hung from her own frame. He opened a tin of meat, something pink and processed that gleamed with fat. Her mouth flooded with saliva so suddenly she nearly choked. "Take it slowly," he said in English, then repeated something in broken German. "Langsam, langsam, slowly, slowly." He held a small piece toward her on a spoon. Hildegard looked at his face, searching for the cruelty she had been taught to expect. She found only exhaustion and something that might have been pity. Her hand shook so violently when she reached for the spoon that he gently caught her wrist to steady it. His touch was not rough. This surprised her more than anything. She took the meat into her mouth, and the taste of salt and fat exploded across her tongue with such intensity that she gasped. The corporal nodded, encouraging, and offered another small portion. Around her, other women were eating, some crying, some silent, all of them moving with the desperate slowness of people who understood that their bodies had forgotten how to process abundance. This was not the liberation Hildegard had imagined during the long winter nights when liberation seemed both inevitable and impossible. She had imagined violence. She had imagined punishment. She had been told, over and over by the authorities who had placed her here, that the enemy were monsters who would delight in German suffering. She had believed this because belief was easier than doubt, and doubt in those days could get you killed. But here was a British soldier, feeding her by hand, telling her in his broken German to eat slowly so she would not make herself sick. Here was gentleness where she had been promised brutality. The dissonance between expectation and reality opened something in her chest that felt like breaking, like the first crack in a frozen river when spring arrives too suddenly. The women in Sandbostel were not soldiers, though they wore the grey uniforms of auxiliary workers. They were clerks, nurses, telephone operators, cooks, women who had been conscripted into service as the war consumed every available body. They had not fired weapons or commanded troops, but they had been part of the machinery nevertheless, and now the machinery had collapsed, crushing them beneath its weight. Some had been fervent believers in the cause, true adherents to the ideology that had promised national rebirth and delivered only ashes. Others had been swept along by circumstance, doing what they were told, because refusal meant death or worse. Hildegard fell somewhere between these poles. She had believed once. She had waved flags and sung songs and felt her heart swell with pride when the newsreels showed triumph after triumph. But belief is a fragile thing, and hunger has a way of clarifying priorities. By the time the British arrived, ideology had become as insubstantial as smoke. The feeding continued for hours. The British had brought medical officers who examined the women with clinical detachment, noting signs of malnutrition and disease in neat columns on clipboards. They distributed rations carefully, understanding that bodies pushed to the edge of starvation could not safely consume normal quantities of food. This knowledge itself spoke to something Hildegard had not anticipated: preparation, planning, consideration of German welfare. The propaganda had never mentioned this possibility. The propaganda had painted the Allies as barbarous hordes who would revel in German agony. Yet here were young men from Yorkshire and Wales and Scotland, patiently spooning soup into the mouths of enemy women, telling them in patient tones to take small bites, to wait between mouthfuls, to let their stomachs adjust. In the days that followed, patterns emerged. The British established a routine: meals at regular intervals, medical checks twice daily, clean water from a well that soldiers had tested and declared safe. They distributed Red Cross parcels containing chocolate and cigarettes, items that had become myths during the final year of the war. Hildegard received a bar of chocolate wrapped in paper that proclaimed it a gift from the British people. She held it in her hands for an hour before unwrapping it, unable to reconcile this gesture with everything she had been taught. When she finally ate it, the sweetness was almost painful, an assault on senses dulled by months of privation. That night, she lay on her thin mattress and tried to understand what was happening. The cognitive dissonance was profound. She had been told that British were subhuman, that they lacked culture and compassion, that they would treat Germans with the same brutality that... But here her thoughts always stumbled, because examining that comparison too closely meant examining things she was not yet ready to confront. The historical record from April 1945 documents similar scenes repeated across dozens of POW camps throughout northern Germany as British forces swept through the collapsing Reich. The liberation of concentration camps in the same period, Bergen-Belsen, Neuengamme, others, had confronted Allied soldiers with horrors that defied description. Many of these same soldiers, traumatized by what they had witnessed in those camps, were then tasked with managing POW facilities housing German military personnel and auxiliaries. The temptation toward vengeful treatment must have been overwhelming. The moral case for harsh retribution would have been easily justified. Yet the official policy, established at the highest levels of British military command, emphasized proper treatment of prisoners in accordance with Geneva Convention standards. This was not mercy born of ignorance. British forces knew exactly what they had liberated. They had walked through the camps and seen the skeletal remains of industrialized murder. They understood the scope of the crimes committed, and still they chose to feed German prisoners by hand, to treat their wounds, to enforce discipline against any soldier who sought personal revenge. Hildegard learned fragments of this reality through conversations with other women who spoke better English, who could understand the soldiers' discussions. She learned that the British had found camps where prisoners were stacked like cordwood, where diseases ran unchecked, where the living could barely be distinguished from the dead. She learned that some British soldiers had wept openly at what they discovered, and she learned that despite this, perhaps because of this, the British High Command had insisted on maintaining standards. "We must show them what civilization looks like," one officer had reportedly said, We must demonstrate the difference. This philosophy permeated the treatment at Sandbostel. When women fell ill, they were moved to medical tents and treated by British doctors. When disputes arose between prisoners, British officers mediated with bureaucratic fairness. When supplies ran short, the British soldiers shared their own rations rather than allow the prisoners to go without. These were not acts of elaborate kindness. They were simply the baseline standards of human decency, applied consistently even to defeated enemies. For Hildegard, each day brought new instances of dissonance. A British corporal taught her a card game during a quiet afternoon, laughing when she won, showing no resentment at defeat by a German. A medical officer gently cleaned an infected wound on her hand, his touch professional and impersonal, explaining through a translator that she needed to keep it dry and clean. A chaplain visited the compound and offered to pray with anyone who wished it, making no distinction between denominations, treating Catholic and Protestant with equal regard. These small interactions accumulated like water drops on stone, gradually reshaping the landscape of her understanding. She began to recognize that the ideology she had absorbed, the ideology that had promised German supremacy and Allied barbarism, had been constructed on foundations of lies. This recognition did not arrive as a sudden revelation. It crept in slowly, almost shamefully, bringing with it a weight of complicity that was difficult to bear. Other women experienced their own reckonings. Some clung desperately to the old beliefs, insisting that this treatment was temporary, that the British were merely establishing grounds for future propaganda, that true punishment would come later. These women watched the daily rations with suspicion, refused medical treatment, maintained rigid distance from their captors. But most, like Hildegard, began the slow process of ideological collapse. They sat in small groups during the long afternoons and spoke in hushed voices about what they were witnessing. They shared observations. The British soldier who had given his own blanket to an elderly prisoner, the officer who had stopped a guard from speaking harshly to a woman who had spilled her water ration, the medical corpsman who stayed late into the night monitoring a prisoner's fever. These stories circulated like contraband, precious and dangerous, because they undermined everything the regime had taught. The psychological impact of this treatment cannot be overstated. These women had been conditioned to believe in their own superiority and in the subhuman nature of their enemies. The entire ideological structure of the regime rested on this foundation. Germans were the master race, destined to rule, while others were lesser beings fit only for subjugation or elimination. When the British arrived with food and medicine instead of bayonets and brutality, that foundation cracked. When British soldiers showed more humanity to defeated German women than German authorities had shown to their own people in the final desperate months of the war, the crack widened into a chasm. Hildegard found herself thinking about the Polish workers she had seen in the factories before her conscription, workers who had been treated as disposable labor, beaten for minor infractions, given inadequate food and shelter. She thought about the propaganda films that had shown enemy peoples as grotesque caricatures, barely human. And then she looked at the British corporal who had taught her cards, at his ordinary face and his patient manner, and understood that she had been lied to about fundamental truths. By the third week of British administration, the camp had transformed. The barracks had been cleaned and repaired. A school had been established where younger prisoners could continue basic education. Work details were organised on a voluntary basis, with women performing tasks in exchange for additional rations and privileges. The atmosphere shifted from one of desperate survival to something approaching normalcy, or at least a new kind of routine. Hildegard volunteered to work in the camp kitchen, peeling potatoes and preparing vegetables under the supervision of a British cook who treated her with distant professionalism. The work was monotonous but oddly comforting. It provided structure, it offered purpose, and it placed her in proximity to British personnel, allowing her to observe them more closely, to study these enemy figures who refused to behave as enemies. The cook, a Londoner named Thomas, who spoke no German, communicated through gestures and simple demonstrations. He showed her how to portion the meals evenly, how to ensure no one received less than their share. He was meticulous about fairness, in a way that struck Hildegard as almost obsessive. Once, when she accidentally gave one prisoner a slightly larger portion than another, he stopped her immediately and corrected the distribution with exaggerated care. At first, she found this annoying. What did it matter if one woman received a few extra beans? But over time, she came to understand the principle at work. Thomas was demonstrating that everyone deserved equal treatment, that no one's needs were less important than another's. This was such a stark contrast to the hierarchies she had known, where some lives were valued more than others based on race, ideology, or utility. In Thomas's kitchen, a 60-year-old clerk received the same meal as a 20-year-old nurse. Status meant nothing. Need was the only currency. The transformation occurring within Hildegard was mirrored across the compound. Women who had arrived hollow-eyed and broken began to show signs of recovery. Not just physical, though the regular meals and medical care made obvious differences, but psychological. They laughed occasionally. They sang sometimes in the evenings, old folk songs that had nothing to do with politics or war. They formed friendships based not on ideological alignment, but on shared experience and genuine affection. The British allowed these developments without interference, maintaining security but not crushing the emerging community. It was as if they understood that healing required not just food and medicine, but also the restoration of human connection, the rebuilding of social bonds that war had frayed and broken. In June, nearly 2 months after the British arrival, a group of officers visited Sandbostel to conduct interviews. They were documenting conditions in POW camps, gathering evidence for future proceedings and policy decisions. Hildegard was among those interviewed. An officer sat across from her at a small table, a translator beside him, and asked careful questions about her treatment since capture. Had she received adequate food? Yes. Had she been mistreated by guards? No. Did she have complaints about medical care? No. The officer made notes, his expression neutral. Then he asked a different kind of question. Had she expected this treatment? The directness caught her off guard. She sat in silence for a long moment, weighing whether honesty was safe. Finally, she spoke. No, she said. She had expected punishment. She had expected brutality. She had been told the British were monsters. The officer looked at her with an expression she could not read. We are not monsters, he said quietly, the translator rendering his words into German. We are simply doing what should be done. The interview ended shortly after, but those words stayed with Hildegard, simply doing what should be done. As if basic human decency required no special justification, as if treating prisoners with respect was so obvious it needed no elaborate defense. The months that followed brought gradual reintegration into civilian life. The British began releasing prisoners who could prove they had not been involved in war crimes, who had civilian homes to return to, who posed no security risk. Hildegard was released in August 1945. She received a small packet of documents, identification papers, a certificate of release, a ration card that would allow her to claim food supplies from Allied distribution points. She also received a Red Cross package to take with her, containing enough food for several days. The British soldier who handed her these items shook her hand formally, wished her well in careful German. The gesture seemed absurd, shaking hands with an enemy, but also profoundly meaningful. It acknowledged her humanity. It treated departure as a normal administrative process rather than an act of mercy or clemency. Hildegard returned to Hamburg, or what remained of it. The city had been bombed into near oblivion, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, the proud architecture of centuries turned to broken stone. She found her family's apartment building miraculously intact, though her mother had died during the firebombing raids and her father had disappeared somewhere on the Eastern Front. She was alone in a ruined world, equipped with a suitcase containing her few possessions and a mind full of uncomfortable revelations. She found work eventually, menial labor clearing rubble and rebuilding infrastructure. Germany had become a massive construction site, and anyone capable of lifting stones could find employment. The work was backbreaking, the pay minimal, but it provided structure and purpose. In the evenings, she would sit in her damaged apartment and think about Sandbostel, about the British soldiers who had fed her by hand, about the corporal who taught her cards, about Thomas in his meticulous kitchen, ensuring every portion was equal. These memories became the foundation of a new understanding. Hildegard began attending lectures sponsored by the occupying authorities, programs designed to re-educate German civilians about democracy, about human rights, about the crimes committed in their name. She listened to accounts of the concentration camps, of the systematic murder of millions, of the industrial machinery of genocide. Part of her wanted to reject these accounts as propaganda, to cling to ignorance and denial. But she could not. The British had shown her that enemies could be humane, that the defeated deserved dignity, that cruelty was not inevitable. If they could demonstrate such principles, then the inverse must also be true. The regime she had served, the ideology she had believed in, had chosen cruelty deliberately. The camps were not aberrations or excesses. They were the logical expression of an ideology that ranked human life in hierarchies of worth. This understanding did not come without cost. Hildegard struggled with guilt, with shame, with the terrible knowledge that she had been complicit in monstrous crimes through her participation, however minor, in the regime's machinery. She had not personally murdered anyone. She had not worked in the camps. But she had believed the lies. She had accepted the propaganda. She had turned away from uncomfortable questions and convinced herself that her small role did not matter. The British treatment at Sandbostel had forced her to confront these failures by demonstrating what moral behaviour actually looked like. They had shown her that choosing humanity over cruelty was possible even in difficult circumstances, even when dealing with defeated enemies who represented a recently hostile power. Their example indicted her previous choices by illustrating the alternatives she had failed to embrace. In the years that followed, Hildegard became active in reconciliation efforts. She joined groups dedicated to documenting Nazi crimes and ensuring they were never forgotten or minimized. She spoke to young people about her experiences, about how easily ordinary people could be swept into supporting evil when they failed to question authority or examine their beliefs critically. She never claimed to be a hero or a resistance figure. She presented herself honestly as someone who had believed lies and served a criminal regime, who had been shown a better way by people she had been taught to hate. This honesty gave her testimony power. She was not preaching from a position of moral superiority. She was acknowledging failure and attempting, in her small way, to prevent its repetition. The British policy of proper treatment for German POWs was not universally popular among Allied forces or civilian populations. Many argued that Germans deserved harsh punishment for the suffering they had inflicted. The discovery of the concentration camps generated enormous public anger, and calls for vengeance were widespread. Some British soldiers struggled to reconcile their orders to treat prisoners humanely with their visceral reactions to what they had witnessed in liberated camps. Yet the policy held. British military authorities understood something crucial: that cycles of vengeance perpetuate themselves, that brutality begets brutality, that building a stable peace required demonstrating the possibility of different approaches. By treating German POWs with basic decency, the British were not forgetting or forgiving German crimes. They were establishing a foundation for future relations built on principles rather than vengeance. This approach bore fruit in the post-war reconstruction. West Germany, under Allied occupation and tutelage, transformed from a totalitarian state into a functioning democracy. The process was neither quick nor easy, and it required massive investment of resources and sustained effort. But it succeeded in ways that previous attempts at German reconstruction after World War I had failed. Part of this success stemmed from the initial approach to defeated Germans, not as irredeemable monsters requiring permanent subjugation, but as people capable of learning from mistakes and building better systems. The hand-feeding at Sandbostel was a microcosm of this larger philosophy. It said, "You have been defeated, but you remain human. You have supported evil, but you can choose differently. You have believed lies, but you can learn truth." These messages, delivered through simple acts of decency, planted seeds that would take years to fully mature, but which eventually contributed to Germany's democratic transformation. Hildegard lived until 1998, dying at age 81 in a Hamburg nursing home. By then, Germany had been reunified, the Cold War had ended, and Europe had achieved a level of peace and prosperity unprecedented in its long, bloody history. In her final years, she would sometimes tell her story to visitors, particularly young people interested in the war years. She would describe Sandbostel, the fear before the British arrived, the shock of being fed by hand, the slow dissolution of beliefs she had held as unquestionable truths. And she would always emphasize one point. The British soldiers had not been exceptional people. They had not been saints or heroes. They had simply been ordinary men following orders that reflected certain principles, that prisoners deserved food, that the sick deserved treatment, that even defeated enemies retained human dignity. They showed us, she would say, what we should have been all along. Not through speeches or lectures, but through simple actions. A piece of bread, a spoonful of soup, a blanket for someone cold. These small things contained entire philosophies. The spring of 1945 at Sandbostel represented a fork in historical roads. One path led toward vengeance and perpetual cycles of retribution. The other led toward recognition of shared humanity, even across lines of conflict. The British chose the latter path, not through naivete or forgetting German crimes, but through deliberate policy aimed at building something better than mere victory. They understood that how you treat defeated enemies shapes not just their future, but your own, that cruelty diminishes everyone it touches, while decency elevates both giver and receiver. This understanding, enacted through thousands of small interactions between British soldiers and German prisoners, helped lay groundwork for post-war reconciliation and the eventual emergence of a peaceful, democratic Germany. The moment when that sandy-haired British soldier knelt beside the elderly German woman and offered her bread contained within it the seeds of this transformation. His patience, his gentleness, his willingness to treat her not as a despised enemy, but as a hungry human being needing food. These choices mattered. They mattered to that one woman in that moment, easing her fear and filling her empty stomach. But they also mattered in aggregate, as similar scenes repeated across the compound, across the camp system, across occupied Germany. Each act of basic decency challenged the narrative of inevitable brutality. Each patient feeding of a starving prisoner demonstrated that other choices were possible. Each small kindness planted doubt in minds conditioned to believe lies about human nature and racial hierarchies. Hildegard's transformation from believer to skeptic to advocate did not happen instantly. It unfolded across months and years, driven by accumulated experiences and difficult reflections. But the foundation was laid in those April days when British soldiers fed her by hand and told her, in broken German, to take it slowly. That moment broke through layers of propaganda and revealed a simple truth she had been prevented from seeing, that people everywhere share basics.
Needs and basic worth, that ideology cannot erase common humanity, that choosing cruelty requires rejecting obvious alternatives. The British showed her those alternatives not through abstract philosophy, but through concrete action. They gave her bread when she expected blows, medicine when she expected neglect, patience when she expected contempt. And in doing so, they gave her something more valuable than material comfort. They gave her the possibility of change. The story of Sandbostel and camps like it offers enduring lessons about the costs of ideology and the power of principle. Ideology had taught Hildegard and millions like her to accept unacceptable things, to participate in unconscionable systems, to believe lies that justified cruelty. It had promised national greatness and delivered only catastrophic defeat and moral ruin. In contrast, the British adherence to principle, treating prisoners humanely even when they represented a recently hostile power, demonstrated that standards could be maintained even in difficult circumstances, that choosing decency over vengeance was possible even when vengeance would have been understandable. This was not a naive or sentimental approach. It was hard-headed pragmatism rooted in understanding that lasting peace requires more than military victory. It requires establishing foundations for different relationships, for new patterns of interaction that break from cycles of revenge. The bread offered by British hands in April 1945 was simply bread. Flour and water and yeast, transformed by heat into sustenance. But in context, it became a symbol of larger possibilities. It represented the choice to feed rather than starve, to heal rather than harm, to recognize humanity in defeated enemies rather than reducing them to despised categories. That choice rippled outward across decades, contributing to reconciliation, rebuilding, and the eventual emergence of lasting peace in Europe. The young soldiers who fed German prisoners by hand could not have known the full implications of their actions. They were simply following orders, doing their duty, maintaining standards in difficult circumstances. But their small acts of decency helped reshape the trajectory of history in ways that grand strategies and elaborate policies could not achieve alone. Hildegard never forgot the taste of that first piece of meat, the salt and fat shocking her depleted system. But more than the physical sensation, she remembered the British corporal's face, his careful expression, his gentle steadying of her shaking hand. She remembered his broken German telling her to take it slowly, to let her body adjust, to not make herself sick through sudden abundance. That concern for her well-being, coming from someone she had been taught to hate, demonstrated truths that lectures could never convey. It showed her that enemies could care, that the defeated deserved consideration, that cruelty was not inevitable in human relations. These revelations did not excuse her complicity or erase German crimes. But they offered a path forward, a way to learn from catastrophic failures and build something better. The bread that broke through layers of ideology and fear contained within it the seeds of transformation, personal, national, and ultimately European. From small acts of decency at a POW camp in northern Germany grew possibilities that shaped the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The lesson remains urgent: how we treat those we have defeated, how we choose between vengeance and principle, how we maintain humanity in the aftermath of inhuman conflict. These choices echo across generations, shaping futures we cannot fully imagine, but must strive to build with care, with conscience, and with the recognition that even in darkness, small lights can illuminate paths toward better worlds.